arduous process of healing. The day he was moved, Ilara finally found the courage to go into his room. Sarah was there, sitting in a chair by the window. Liam was propped up in the bed, his leg in a heavy cast, his head still bandaged, but his eyes were open. They were a clear, startling blue, and they fixed on her the moment she stepped through the doorway. The moment was charged, heavy with unspoken words. Sarah stood up. "I'll go get us some tea," she said softly, and slipped out, leaving them alone. Ilara stood just inside the door, clutching the strap of her bag like a lifeline. The room was quiet, but for the soft hum of a machine monitoring his vitals. She looked at him, and all the carefully rehearsed speeches she had prepared in her head vanished. She felt the sting of tears in her eyes. "Hi," she managed to whisper. Liam's voice, when it came, was a dry croak. "You're okay?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of relief. In that moment, lying there, broken and bandaged, his first thought was still for her safety. A sob escaped her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm fine because of you." She took a hesitant step closer. "I'm Ilara. I don't even know how to... There are no words." He gave her a weak, lopsided smile that was heartbreakingly gentle. "Liam," he said, "and you don't need any words. I saw the car. You were just... frozen." "I was," she admitted, the memory of that terror flashing through her mind. "I couldn't move. And then you just appeared." He closed his eyes for a moment, the effort of speaking tiring him. "It was instinct," he murmured. "Saul didn't even think about it." This was the second time someone had said that to her. Instinct. It was a simple word for an act of incomprehensible courage. For Ilara, who lived her life by thought and planning, this pure, unthinking action was a revelation. She pulled the chair Sarah had vacated closer to his bed and sat down. She didn't try to thank him anymore. She just sat with him. And that became the pattern. Ilara became a fixture in Liam's recovery. Her days took on a new, unplanned routine. She would go to the library in the mornings, working feverishly on her thesis, the words flowing easier now, as if his act of courage had unlocked something in her own mind. Then in the afternoons, she would go to the hospital. She would bring books from the library, at first for herself, then for him. And she discovered he loved old crime novels. The grittier the better. She would read aloud to him when he was too tired to hold the book himself. She learned about his work, his passion for creating things from wood, the furniture he built, the satisfaction he got from a perfectly executed dovetail joint. In turn, she told him about her research, the forgotten stories of ordinary people in history, and he listened with a genuine, patient interest that surprised her. The nurses would see them, heads together, her animatedly explaining some historical footnote, him listening with a quiet smile. Or sometimes they would just be quiet, her reading, him dozing, a comfortable silence settling between them that felt more intimate than any conversation. The guilt that had initially consumed her began to slowly, subtly transform. And it didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else. Gratitude, yes, but also a deep and abiding respect, and a connection, a bond forged in the crucible of that moment on the rainy street that was unlike any she had ever known. One afternoon, as she was helping him with the simple physiotherapy exercises the doctors had prescribed for his arm, he stopped and looked at her intently. "Why do you keep coming?" he asked, his blue eyes searching her face. "I mean, you've done more than enough. You don't have to." Ilara paused, the small weight in her hand forgotten. It was a fair question. The debt of life was immense, but she had been there for weeks. What was she still doing here? She looked at him, at the faded bruises on his face, at the strong, calloused hand she was holding. "Because," she said, and the truth of the words surprising her as she spoke them. When you saved my life, you didn't just give me back my future. You gave me a new one, and I don't want to go back to the old one. I want to be here, with you. This was her response. It wasn't a payment. It was a choice. The choice to build something new from the wreckage of that day. Part 4. 6 months later, Ilara stood in a sun-drenched workshop that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. It was Liam's space, a converted garage behind the small house he was slowly renovating. The afternoon light streamed through the large windows, illuminating the fine particles of dust dancing in the air. He was at his workbench, his back to her, his movement sure and steady as he planed a long piece of oak. The cast was long gone, replaced by a faint limp that only showed when he was tired. And the scars on his head were hidden by his hair, which had grown back. To anyone else, he was fully recovered. But Ilara saw the occasional flicker of pain in his eyes, the moments of quiet when the memory of the accident resurfaced. They both had those moments. Ilara watched him work, a familiar feeling of peace settling over her. She had finished her thesis, a well-regarded piece on community resilience in post-war Manchester, and had been offered a position at a local archives. Her life was no longer a series of meticulously planned events, but it was full, rich with purpose, and, most importantly, with him. He sensed her presence and turned, a smile lighting up his face. It was the smile she lived for, the one that reached his blue eyes and crinkled the corners. "You're early," he said, putting down the plane and wiping his hands on a rag. "Finished up at the archives," she said, walking towards him. "Thought I'd come and see the master at work." She glanced at the piece of wood on his bench. It was a wide, beautifully grained plank of walnut. "What's this for?" He looked at the wood, then back at her, a sudden shyness in his expression. "It's for you," he said. "Well, for us, if you want it." He reached behind the bench and brought out a folded piece of paper, handing it to her. It was a detailed pencil sketch, rendered with the precision of someone who understood both art and engineering. It was a table, not just any table. It was a dining table, sturdy and elegant, with simple, clean lines and subtly flared legs. In the corner of the sketch, he had written a single word: shelter. Ilara looked from the sketch to him, her heart swelling in her chest. She understood immediately. This was his response. She had responded to his act of courage with her presence, her care, her love. He was now responding to her response. The table was a symbol. It was a place where they would sit, where they would share meals, where they would build a life. It was a shelter from the storms, a tangible representation of the haven they had found in each other. "It's beautiful, Liam," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect." He took a step closer, gently taking the sketch from her hand and placing it on the bench. He took her hands in his touch warm and familiar. "That day on the street," he began, his voice low, "I didn't think. I just moved. But in that split second, I saw you, standing there with your arms full of books, and I just knew I had to. I couldn't let anything happen to you. I didn't know you, but I knew that. And I didn't know you," Ilara replied, looking up into his eyes. "But I know now. I know the man who builds things with his hands, the man who reads old crime novels, the man who has a sister he adores and a quiet strength that amazes me. I know the man who gave me my life back." He lifted one hand and gently cupped her face. "You gave me mine back too, you know," he said. "Lying in that hospital bed, I felt so broken. But you came. Day after day. You didn't just sit with me. You pulled me back into the world. You reminded me why it was worth fighting to get better. This was the truth of it. It had never been about a debt. It was a cycle. His instinct had saved her, and her conscious, devoted choice had, in turn, saved him from the despair and isolation of his recovery. They had rescued each other. The car accident was a singular, horrific event, but the story that followed was a quiet, daily act of mutual salvation. He leaned in and kissed her softly, a promise sealed in the warm, sawdust-scented air of his workshop. It was a kiss that held the memory of the rain, the terror, the hospital room, and the slow, steady building of a bond that was unbreakable. When they finally pulled apart, Elara looked at the sketch of the table again. "Shelter," she read aloud. "I love it." "It's not finished," he said, a mischievous glint in his eye. "I was thinking it needs 2 chairs to start with. But eventually, maybe more." She laughed, a bright, free sound that filled the workshop. "Eventually," she agreed. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor, they stood together, watching the light fade. They weren't thinking about the past, about the screech of tires or the sterile smell of the hospital. They were thinking about the future, about the table they would build together, the meals they would share, the life they would create. He had shielded her from a speeding car. She had shielded him from a slower, quieter kind of death. And in doing so, they had found not just a response to a single, terrible moment, but a shared answer to the question of how to live. Their story, which had begun with a violent collision, had become a gentle, enduring shelter of their own making. And it was just the first chapter.